right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the start of our fall and into winter webinar series entitled The Art and Science of Making Meaningful Moments, the Subtle Strategies and Creative Conditions for Effective and Uplifting Facilitation. So my name is Kristine Glauber, and I am the InterReach webinar chair. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all today and introduce our speakers and set the stage for this informative and well-timed and knowing what I know about Hannah and our other speakers, no doubt will be fun webinar series. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Hannah and to her co-host Alyssa Stevens for pulling together this incredible 8-part series on facilitation. And I just want to start out with a little bit of a reflection. A colleague of ours recently posed the question, what are we going to call this sort of kind of facilitation that we're all engaged in? The definition of the word facilitate doesn't really capture what we're doing when we're attempting to span boundaries, to expand the boundaries of our collective knowledge. It certainly describes the traditional use of meeting facilitation, or the traditional way in which we facilitate meetings, which I bet most of us have on this call have done. But since many of us are working both in the interstices of our institutions, our cultures, and our disciplines, among other boundaries that we span, at the same time, we're also trying to push for development and recognition of this important role in research. And we realized that it's really about time for us here as a community within InterReach to have a conversation about what this is, how it's done, and how it's evaluated. So with that, I would like to welcome and introduce our series host and one of our presenters today, Hannah Love, who's going to tell us more about the origins of this work and her work with facilitation. So Dr. Hannah Love is a team scientist and professional facilitator. She works full-time doing team science consulting with Divergent Science LLC. Hannah has 12 years of facilitation experience in higher education, water conflict, and science facilitation. And since 2015, she has been designing trainings, retreats, and workshops for scientific teams. And our other speaker today is Dr. Courtney. Courtney, you're going to have to tell me how to pronounce your name. Ngai. Okay. All right. I was close. Dr. Courtney Ngai is a chemist and educator by training and uses her scientific interpersonal skill to support teams to establish a positive and productive culture. By helping teams think about their process, she supports them in making progress towards their desired goals. She is also the founder of Empowered Consult. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers, Hannah and Courtney.
All right, so I'm going to start off today doing something a little bit different. Unless you've been on calls with me before at Insights or InterReach or our SIG. So I learned actually from Kristine that it works really well to start off with a centering activity. And she's going to drop a link in the chat here. This actually came from a blog post from Gabrielle Bammer on convergence research. And the point behind it is that you need to bring your whole self to solve these complex problems. And so on the surface, that might mean that you can't be solving a complex problem while you're on your cell phone or checking email. You need to all be present. On a more emotional and mental level, it's about centering and bringing yourself to the problem today. So I'm going to spend about 30 seconds walking us through a very brief centering activity. So if you could please close your eyes. When you're out of center, you're often overthinking things. There's too much energy swirling around in your head. And so to manage this, plant both your feet firmly on the ground. And then bring your awareness to the bottom of your feet. Wiggle your toes. Think about what part of your feet is actually touching the ground and what part of your feet is connecting with the earth beneath you. This practice draws excess energy down into your body. And just pay attention to any sensation that you have in your feet. And then pay attention to your legs. to your core, to your chest, to your head, to your neck. And take 3 deep breaths. So inhale and exhale. Inhale and exhale. Inhale and exhale. And practicing this just a few times before you start any activity, especially a complex problem, helps with your presence. So now I'd like to bring awareness back to the screen. If you're comfortable and if you're able, if you could turn your camera on. And I just want to acknowledge everybody who's here today, who is taking time to be together in a world that is still relatively apart. And I want to thank you all for taking your time and dedicating energy to being present on today's call. If you are more comfortable with your camera off, that is fine. But I thank you for putting it on for a second. So I'm going to share my screen and we are going to get going. Give me just 1 second here. All right, so it's our centering activity. All right, so our presentation today is called The Science Behind Facilitation. And this is an introduction to a whole series on facilitation. Kristine introduced us already, so I'm going to kind of skip this slide and jump to talking a little bit about the Facilitation Guild. We're a group of facilitation consultants, and we have a very diverse amount of expertise. So we work in higher education, we're science researchers, we're small business owners. Collectively, we have over 90 years of interdisciplinary experience as facilitators. And because we're so diverse, each week or each month, you're going to hear about a completely different topic. We have people that are going to present about mindfulness, community engagement, social change, and so much more. Our goal is to leave you with fresh ideas that can lead to big changes within your organization and create a lasting impact for you and for others. Now, this is important. So facilitation doesn't really end with just a presentation. So much about facilitation involves practice and reflection. And so after every presentation in this series, we're going to host office hours. And so same time next week, but a new Zoom link, and we'll send that around later. Courtney and I will be available for you to come on, ask questions, pick our brains, get feedback on either our presentation or your experiences, or maybe you're having trouble with something and you want to talk about it, and we want to be available to you. So that's what office hours are all about. And that's going to occur after every presentation in the series. Now, before we dive in, I want to give a little caveat. Facilitation is about managing the ideas, resources, budget, and so much more. And usually that involves doing it all at the same time. This takes years of practice. You make a lot of mistakes when you're getting started, and some deep reflection. Other courses that we've all taught on facilitation have involved regular meetings for weeks. And so my caveat is this is an appetizer, and we hope that it leaves you hungry for more. So Courtney.
Yeah, and with that being said, I think that there are still a number of learning objectives that we hope you get out of today's session. The first being that you will gain a general understanding about facilitation and how it can support problem solving, and particularly support group processes. Learn who benefits from facilitation and who can be a facilitator. We hope you gain an increased understanding about the science of team science literature and how it informs facilitation practices and team science. And practically, we want you to walk away with at least 2 facilitation strategies that you can use in your everyday meetings. So there are a number of things that we want you to keep in mind for today's workshop, and we're going to keep this as interactive as possible. So we'd like you to be ready for polls. If you have a place where you'd like to take notes, whether that's in a physical pen and paper, or if you have a Word document you'd like to keep open, and please check out the links that we are about to put in the chat and open those up now. Get yourself ready for some of those interactive activities that we have planned for later in this workshop. And with that being said, we are actually going to start our first poll. to keep everyone engaged. And so the first poll that we have for you today is about the Latin root facilitate. So what does this mean? I'm going to give you a moment to respond. All right, we got lots of folks responding here. Almost everyone is responding to say to enable, to make easy. And that is the correct choice. The Latin root of facilitate means to enable or to make easy. And we're hoping that by the end of today, it's clear how facilitation helps make group processes easier. And this is our roadmap for today. So we're going to cover, the basics of what is facilitation. We're going to talk about some foundational best practices, including introductions and ground rules, using facilitation in group processes. And then we're going to cover one tool that you can use right now called intentional silence that you can take back to your group settings. And we're going to wrap up with the notion of how you can use facilitation to bring joy to your group interactions, whether those are meetings or team gatherings and events, how facilitation can support this process. So let's start by covering what is facilitation. And in order to do proper facilitation, we want to talk about our first best practice for facilitation, which is you can't really facilitate well if you don't know who is in the room with you. And so we'd like to invite you all to drop your name, area of expertise, and what do you hope to learn. Please put that in the chat for us, and Hannah and I will be taking the time to go through that chat later as we go back and forth leading this workshop. And we hope to get to know you a little bit better, and we hope that everyone who's participating has the opportunity to get to know each other a little bit better. We don't necessarily have time to do individual introductions today, unfortunately, because I'd really like to get to know you all, but we would like to hear a little bit more about you and about who is in the room today with us. And, I've already mentioned that facilitation can be used to support group processes or team practices. And what does that really mean? And so I'd like you to think about what are the practices that your team or your group engages in. And to help you answer this question, it might be useful to think about, well, what exactly happens in a team meeting? So you're probably not just meeting to hang out and socialize, as much as I'd like to do that. You're probably meeting to do a whole bunch of things. So, for example, some practices that your team might engage in include brainstorming or identifying action items or practicing shared leadership and trying to disperse the power structure. So, because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how facilitation supports group practices or team processes, I'd like to spend a few extra minutes now hearing from you all about the practices that your teams engage in. So we're going to drop that link in the chat again if you don't already have it open, and it's a Padlet. And so on the Padlet, you will see that there are already some sticky notes that have examples of other team practices. Please add your examples of team practices that your groups engage in and add those to the Padlet. And then we're going to take a moment to reflect on them. And if you're having trouble accessing the link or adding to the Padlet, please just raise your hand or just give a shout. And I already see some folks joining and adding. That's great. To add a post-it or to add some text to the page, you can either double click on the page or click on the bright pink plus sign that's in the lower right-hand corner of the screen.
We've got a great variety here. Ground rules, we're going to talk about that one, deciding when and how to meet, shared leadership, brainstorming, developing a vision, explaining to each other what we know, delegating. These are awesome.
I'm going to give everyone about 10 more seconds to add what your thoughts are on the team practices that you engage in. Ooh, mind mapping for shared language. That's a great one. Yep, giving everyone the opportunity to speak. Yeah, so these are some really great examples of how many different processes there are that teams and groups engage in. And chances are there are probably 100 more that we're not even covering with this Padlet right now. And this is just a very small sampling of the different things that we engage in. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on the different team practices that folks engage in. And Hannah, if you could go back now to the PowerPoint. So what's great about facilitation is that it can help with all of those group processes that you all just identified. And facilitation is really meant to think about the different practices and processes that teams engage in and how to make them more effective or more productive or feel better really for the team. And as one of our fellow guild members likes to say, winging it is not a collaboration style. So just coming to a team meeting without a plan and just, ad hoc going, okay, we're gonna do this today without like really thinking through what that looks like. That's not necessarily the most effective way to collaborate. And this is where facilitation can really step in and shine. And so facilitation involves managing the people, resources, and ideas of a collaborative group, much by thinking through those processes that we just talked about and creating processes for everything to work together. And so, this can include creating a safe space for teams to fully engage in the work so that everyone has a voice, or helping teams identify strengths and weaknesses. And this is the sort of work that facilitators can get involved in. And so ultimately, by participating in facilitation can help accomplish creating group processes that are equitable and inclusive, that engage the wisdom and creativity of every group member, and to create a space where everyone is actively listening to all the voices that are in the room. And to also create a space where participants engage in every part of the process. And so they end up owning the outcome by creating this space where folks can truly engage in the work that the team is engaged in. You create a much more equitable process where folks feel more ownership and responsibility for what is happening in the team's products. But that being said, who can be a facilitator? And so, as you attend more of our sessions and get to know the other folks in Facilitation Guild, you'll notice that facilitators can come from all different backgrounds, right? And we have all different types of expertise that we're bringing to the table. And facilitators are generally people who want to change the way that business is done, people who want to create an equitable process for teams, people who are tired of attending meetings where nothing gets done. I'm sure we've all experienced that. And also people who are tired of attending meetings where their voice isn't heard and trying to figure out, okay, people aren't listening to me, or people are ignoring this other group member. And how do we change that? How do we make it a better group process?
All right, so what are some of the practical aspects of facilitation? We've talked about these already, but
Sorry, Hannah, I just muted you. My apologies.
You're fine. Sorry, technical difficulties. What are some of the practical aspects of facilitation? So we listed some on the Padlet, but just to highlight a few, it involves creating ground rules and setting an agenda and talking about what type of conversations are necessary to do work or build consensus. Because again, facilitation is about creating a process that everyone's engaged in so that then they own the outcome. There we go. All right, so one of the first steps in facilitation is about setting ground rules. And I call ground rules a proactive approach to conflict. And a quick note on this. So I first learned facilitation skills in higher education. And in higher education, we always called them ground rules. And before every single class with every single student group, I always created ground rules. And in 2015, I sat down with my first scientific team and I went, this team has problems and they're solvable. We can figure this out. And I wanted them to create ground rules, and they were just like curmudgeon-y about it. And they were like, no, that's too touchy-feely. Like, I don't want to do that. And so I changed the name and I started calling them team values. And oh my gosh, that transformed the landscape. So I'm telling you this, that sometimes it's just these little tweaks that transform how people respond. So I'm going to call these ground rules / team values. And who should create them? I do them in classrooms. Anytime I'm in front of a class, I create ground rules. And this might be your experience. What I have found over the years is that students will create much harsher ground rules than I ever would have created with the instructor, as the instructor. Lab groups, they need ground rules. They need rules about cleaning up, ordering supplies, and how they're going to operate. Obviously, we're talking about teams today, so teams need ground rules, but collaborative groups, especially when you are in different places, in different locations, when you're in this virtual world, how do you navigate these can be set by your team values. There are two types of team values that I encourage teams to focus on. The first are behavioral. So these are items about how the team is going to interact. So these might include turn taking, participation, and just everyday interactions. And then there's procedural items. And these are more about their everyday system. So I already mentioned, like, how is your lab going to be cleaned up? How are you going to complete action items? And what are we going to do about people being on time? These get confusing at some point. And so when I'm doing this in real life, sometimes my lists just kind of merge together at some point, and that's okay. But you want to start off thinking about these separate categories and thinking really broadly. So I've got a Jamboard link here, and Kristine is going to drop that into the chat. I'd like to know, what are your favorite ground rules? Or what is your favorite team value? And what we're going to do is we're going to create this Jamboard, and then we'll send this out to you afterwards, or we'll post it somewhere where you can access it. So you have a list of ideas that you can bring back to your team. So I'm going to stop sharing here so that we can all look at this Jamboard as it's being created. Have fun. Somebody is speaking to my heart. That is my absolute favorite ground rule or team value. I will not let teams move forward until they get that one. Some teams just never think of that, especially like those hardcore scientific teams. You don't realize this should be fun. If you're not having fun, then why are we all here together? Bring humor, yes. Parking lot, end on time. Oh my gosh, I love these.
My favorite is to move at the speed of trust. I might have to take that one from, thank you for giving me that idea.
Yeah, that's one of the three core principles from the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think it originally comes from Stephen Covey, actually, but it's a really good one.
Love that one.
I'm co-chair of the incubation, team acceleration and incubation SIG for Insights. And we had a whole conversation in January, and then it impacted most of our spring conversations about this no assholes, and it's a book, so excuse my language. And that's what people wanted to talk about, is how are you kind and respectful on teams? Okay, this is a phenomenal list. Okay. Any others that people want to highlight quickly?
I like the hard on science, soft on people one. I haven't heard that before.
Assume positive intentions. If teams would do this, we wouldn't have to have this conversation. I love it.
I really like the first names. I haven't been in a lot of places where doctors use, but I can see that that would be challenging if that is the norm. So really defaulting to first names.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I agree. Okay. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. A pro tip. I see teams create ambitious and beautiful ground rules, and then they just set them to the side. They never look at them again. And this is a problem, especially when you're onboarding new team members, especially since literature says a little team turn is healthy. And so you have this constant influx of graduate students, maybe undergraduate students, new team members as the team goes different directions. And so you must revisit the ground rules at regular intervals. And it doesn't have to be every month. It can be at your annual retreat, the start of semesters, the start of school years, but make it a point to come back to the ground rules as needed. So I'm going to transition a little bit to how we use facilitation and group processes. And I want to talk about the theory behind what we're doing. And so first, this is the literature. This is how I see this connecting to team science literature. Early literature in team science was really focused on bibliometric data to search for predictors of team success. So they were using these big data sets to try and figure out who's collaborating, how are they collaborating, are they successful, are they publishing more? And there was evidence. And so obviously the literature kept rolling. But today, a growing body of literature is really talking about how do teams engage emotionally? How do they interact effectively? And how do you consider the process and the human capital? And these really overlap with facilitation literature. And so I have this image of these two elephants colliding because I think that these bodies of literature are on a collision course. And so I'm going to present some of the theory behind facilitation. And my favorite facilitation book is Kainer. If you've worked with me before, I maybe have shown you these, but Kainer talks about group processes and says, this is how we think decisions happen. So we have a new topic and we think that because we have this NSF grant or we have this NIH grant, that everything's headed in this somewhat linear path. And what we know as facilitators that that's not how this happens, that we have the kickoff meeting, we say, okay, we've got this pot of money we're going to go after, and all of a sudden ideas start going in all these different directions. And Kainer tells us that this is either chaos or if it's channeled correctly, it can be creativity. So this is the full diagram. So you recognize on the left, the divergent thinking, and that's what we just talked about. And this middle area is called the groan zone. And on any team you've ever been a part of, I'm sure there's a moment where you've thought, yes, we are groaning. And this groan zone is reflected in other bodies of literature. So if you're familiar with Tuckman and his forming, storming, norming, performing, the groan zone is storming. So you got together, you had this idea, and now you're going to groan, and it's uncomfortable. And I always say this is the best place to have a facilitator, because in this place, a facilitator can say, yeah, this isn't comfortable. Yeah, this is awkward. Yeah, we don't really know where we're going, but we're going to get through it because on the other side, we're going to converge. So my question is, how do you turn the groan zone into something productive? And Kainer talks about it in terms of divergent thinking and convergent thinking. So to go back, this is the far left and the far right of this diagram. So when we're practicing divergent thinking, we're generating a list of ideas. And this is when you get ground rules like all ideas are okay, and this is a safe space to say something crazy. As a facilitator, I always want to make sure that undergraduates and graduate students are included because they'll sometimes say really crazy ideas because they don't know what's impossible, and it can lead to other really brilliant ideas. And you want to promote free flowing open discussion. This is where diversity is so important. I was working on an article this week, and early literature was really down on diversity on teams. And now it's like, that is where innovation comes from. You need diverse perspectives to get to these really creative ideas. And it's important to suspend judgment, and that's why we need ground rules. And only after you have done all sorts of divergent thinking can you converge. And I think this is where NSF came up with convergent research, because then at some point you sort it into categories, you summarize key points, you come to agreement, and you exercise judgment. But it's after you go through this whole process that then you have convergence. So what is facilitation? It's about managing these ideas, the discussion, the resources, and more. And I like to add, really all at the same time. So when you do this, and there's a process and a little structure to it, instead of chaos, which we discussed as a possible outcome, you can have creativity. And so that is the goal of why we have facilitation and where we're going. So I want to have another quick note. So often in our democratic society, we talk about the need to be eloquent. And what we mean by that is we believe someone if they're confident. And if they can say, oh, these are all the details for the topic, or if they have so much emotion in what they're saying and more. I think you all know what I'm talking about. But when we're in this process as scientists trying to come up with solutions to complex global problems, we're probably not going to be eloquent. And it's our job as facilitators to listen to the ideas that aren't fully developed or aren't eloquent yet, or maybe they haven't thought through the whole thing, but they just have this spark that they know it's in there. And I have found, as I said previously, that great ideas frequently come from intimidated graduate students or insecure postdocs. And so making sure that they have a voice in the room, I take very seriously as my responsibility as a facilitator. So now I'm going to pass to Courtney. She's going to talk about one tool to use now.
Yeah, so the tool that we have to share with you today is really rooted in that teen science literature. That's okay. The teen science literature related to social sensitivity, and that's what developed this or prompted this particular facilitation technique. And when we talk about social sensitivity, that really involves how we read the room and thinking about how we know how folks are reacting to new information or interpreting it, if they're ready to move on with the discussion, or if you really need to hang on and wrap up a conversation in a particular way before moving on. And so as a facilitator, you have to be really attentive to reading what's going on with the other team members who are in the room with you or who are on a virtual meeting with you. And so this is what we call social intelligence, which is the ability to read the emotions of others. And so one thing that can help you.
Oh, can I add something really quick?
Yeah, go for it, Hannah.
So this Woolley in this study is really based on the idea of reading the mind's eye, and that's how she came up with her definition. But how do you put this into practice? How do you actually do that? And so that's what we're talking about today. Sorry, go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, thanks for that. And so the technique that we want to talk about today is really supporting you in giving you the time and space to help you read the room, but also to give folks a chance to process. And so this is what we call intentional silence. And using intentional silence is really useful because some people need extra time to think, right? We don't all process information at the same rate. And that goes for, students and faculty and lab researchers and everyone in between, right? So we all process things a little bit differently. And, I think it is, as Hannah mentioned earlier, we're really working with complex ideas here, particularly when we're doing interdisciplinary science work. And when you're working with complex ideas, sometimes you really need to do much deeper thinking than you need to do. It's better to do deeper thinking than the surface level, and that's going to take some extra time. And you can also use intentional silence to honor moments of exceptional poignancy, which could be anything from, a momentous decision that has been released, that has been reached, to honor that, okay, we are now here, we are now at this final stage. Or when you're sharing new information with folks to recognize that, hey, this is very important information, so maybe we're going to take some time to process that. And so how you might incorporate this into your work is to stay relaxed and focused on who is speaking at that time, and maybe speaking at a moment where you might decide as a facilitator you want to take some time to process afterwards. And as a facilitator, you know, if you're facilitating virtually, you might want to count to 15 seconds because it takes a little bit more time to process things virtually with the time delay and also just people being present. And if you're in person with folks, counting to 7 can be enough time to allow folks to process. And you might want to note that you were about to do this, that you're about to provide some intentional silence by saying, hey, let's all take a moment to let that sink in, or let's take a breath here and just pause for a minute. And so we're going to actually practice this right now. And so I have a couple of prompts for you all. And what I would like you to do is respond to this prompt in the chat. So I'm going to give you a question and you all should pull up the chat right now and respond to the prompt in the chat, but don't press enter until I say go. Okay, so that gives everyone enough time to process individually, which is something I know I like to do as a facilitator, is to first do some individual processing before doing some group processing. Okay, and so there will be silence during the activity to allow for everyone to have an equal opportunity to respond, and then we will get to read each other's responses. So the first prompt for you all to respond to is design your dream vacation. So now I'd like you all to go into the chat and think about what does your dream vacation look like, okay? And type whatever you feel comfortable sharing with the group into the chat, but don't hit enter yet. And the timing is starting now. Okay, so by now you should have your answers typed in the chat, and I would like everyone to hit enter now. I'm liking this hammocking and margaritas that I'm seeing here. Ooh, the Galician coast of Spain. Wow, that sounds excellent. Ocean waves, sightseeing, spending time in nature with family and friends, not rushed. That sounds great. Outdoors, coffee. All right, so these are looking pretty great. I'm already there mentally and envisioning where I'd like to be right now. So we're going to repeat this activity and I'm going to give you a second prompt. Okay, so the second prompt, you're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to respond in the chat and then hit enter when I say go. All right, so the second prompt is design your perfect meal and go. All right, so you should all have your answers in the chat and you should hit enter now. Oh boy. Sushi, colorful fruits and veggies, mochi, yes. I like the wine that's being tossed in all over the place here. Mocha. Great. Grilled veggies, ice cream. All right, so we just demoed this in 2 different ways, right? So we first gave you a much longer time to respond. And so for the first question, I gave you actually a full minute to respond. And that's a really long time, a full minute. But I do want to note that, you know, the responses that you all had to that first question were more detailed, and maybe that's just because you have more details in mind about your dream vacation versus your, you know, your dream, your perfect meal, right? Like that could just be the case. But also, you know, in the second question, we only gave you about 15 seconds to respond, which also when you're in person, it's hard to wait 15 seconds for folks to respond. Like even just waiting 15 seconds is really, really challenging. But you'll see that there were a lot more detail in the responses when you had more time to respond, right? And providing folks with that space can be really, really important. So, you know, as a facilitator, you can do this in a couple of different ways. You can tell folks that you're going to give time, you can wait, and in the moment, just give some deep breaths, and either counting to 7 or, you know, taking 3 deep breaths, you know, should give you people sufficient time to really process and respond in meaningful ways, right? And like, that's really what we want to get out of this, is meaningful conversation where folks feel like they have the time to process and really engage in whatever the conversation is. And so I do want to give folks a chance to reflect right now on the activity we just did. And so, you know, I invite folks to either respond to the chat or, you know, raise your hand and take yourself off of mute, because I think we have time for a couple of folks to share their thoughts. So, you know, I'd like to hear from folks, you know, what happened to your thoughts during the silence, and what happened when you had more time versus less time. So if folks want to respond to those 2 questions first, and then I have another question for you all to think about. So do folks have any thoughts on that? Tanya says you had more time to dream. Oh, and Stephanie says in the second one you felt rushed. Yeah, and that was even with 15 full seconds. Other reflections on how you felt during that silent time? Ooh.
Okay, I love that Ryan said he revised his idea.
Yeah. And Brent, I hear you about a worry about getting the words right? I mean, I think that's something I know I struggle with as well, is thinking about, am I saying the right thing? 15 seconds felt like panic ordering at a restaurant. It's true, right? Oh my gosh. It's like, well, you're standing there, you're ready to hear, the waitress is ready to hear from you, or the waiter is ready to hear from me, and I don't know what to say. And that can be the case in a meeting too, right? When the conversation is moving so quickly that you're like, I don't have time to get a thought out and into this conversation. I don't have time to enter this conversation because I just don't know what I want to say yet, right?
I want to read Sarah's out loud because they're so thoughtful. So she says, less intimidating, way more inviting, better sense of belonging. Didn't feel like I had to change my answer to fit in as much to match the quality of responses of others.
Yeah. And Mark, I appreciate you saying that your response was less authentic during the shorter pause, right? You had to quickly just fire it out there. Yeah, and Carrie, I really appreciate your note on that intentional silence that isn't filled with doing something is also important. I agree with that. Like sometimes it is totally acceptable to just sit in silence with something without having to share anything, you know, or contribute back to the conversation before moving on, right? I think that is also a totally useful facilitation technique and an appropriate use of intentional silence as well. All right, so I have one other follow-up question for you all, and I'd like to ask, you know, is it different for you in terms of intentional silence and listening? Is it different in a virtual environment versus an in-person environment, right? So we are now shifting to virtual environments also being the norm, or hybrid environments being the norm. So as facilitators, how might we, and as team members engaging in group work, how might our interactions and engagement change for the virtual environment versus the in-person environment? And I invite you to, you know, share things out loud on the Zoom or use the chat feature as before.
Well, I think what you just said there, Courtney, is one major difference. In most of the virtual things I've been in, there's at least 2 conversations going on.
Yes.
There's the conversation we're having on the screen, and there's the conversation we're having on the chat.
Yep. Absolutely.
Which sometimes I really like that, and it really adds things. And then sometimes it's literally 2 channels going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think you might have noted, that Hannah and I are really trying to take care to make sure that we're repeating a lot of the things that are happening in the chat, right? So that those two conversations are integrated and people aren't missing stuff on either end. And what I appreciate about the chat, I know, as an instructor, is that a lot of students felt more comfortable engaging using the chat rather than unmuting themselves in the Zoom room, right? And so the same can be true for other group members too that aren't students. So just something to keep in mind. Any other thoughts on like the virtual versus the in-person environment and how that might change intentional silence?
I've been I call it pre-mourning the loss of chat as a tool for quieter people to or just to add your +1 to someone's idea without being, kind of disruptive.
Definitely.
And I've been wondering what in-person approaches could maybe serve a similar purpose for quieter people.
Yes, agreed. I think Hannah might have something she wants to share about that.
So I was facilitating a team one time, and I happened to see one of the people the night before, and he came up to me and he goes, "What's your plan for tomorrow?" And I kind of ran through some things and he goes, "That will not work." And I said, "Why not?" And he goes, "We are mega introverts. Like whatever you have in your mind about an introvert," he goes, "like double it, triple it." He goes, "That is not going to work for us." And so what we did, I couldn't even get ground rules out of this. So as people walked in, I knew a few familiar faces. I handed them ground rule cards and I said, "Here's your ground rule card. Say this out loud and we're going to see if we can crowdsource even like 2 more." And I was thrilled when we got to like 7 ground rules. And then we were worried about just general comments. And so we gave time for them to write everything down first. Literally before every single question, we said, "Okay, and we're just going to write and then share with your neighbors." So like a think, pair, share, or I know there's lots of words to describe that. And we always gave time for that internal processing. And at the end of it, he came up to me and he's like, "Now we've got it right. Now we've got it." And so there are ways to do it and ways to recreate it, but you have to be creative.
Definitely.
Other thoughts?
I do want to point out that there are a couple of comments in the chat, about you can use the chat to have snarky jokes in the chat, which can be distracting, but also important for developing real relationships. And I think that's awesome. I know my students would throw memes into the chat all the time, they loved it. It was amazing, right? And talking in class, virtual, it's okay to do that. That's great to use a chat feature, or helping with turn taking. These are all great thoughts on how things might differ a little bit in virtual versus in person. Well, if there aren't any other observations or things that folks would like to share about best practices that they have noticed, I just want to thank you all for engaging that activity, and hopefully intentional silence, no matter how you use it, is a practice that you can take back to any of your group engagements, whether it's virtual or in person.
All right, so I'm going to wrap up here and talk just a little bit about how facilitation can bring joy. And we've hinted at this throughout, and this is definitely a theme that we are going to carry throughout this entire series. And I think during that intentional silence activity, you could add to this list. So by practicing intentional silence, which is a key facilitation technique, people felt relaxed. They had time to process. We know that people say they feel heard and they feel respected. There are also things in terms of process. So it can create a fair process. It can prevent the team from wandering around aimlessly, because as Anne Herberger-Marino says, winging it is not a collaboration style. It can also promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, because you can be intentional about turn taking and how voices are included. And it's also an opportunity for caretaking, because if you come into it with a plan, then you have time to laugh. You have time to take bio breaks and make sure that you're physically and mentally healthy and present in what you are doing. So to briefly summarize, facilitation is different than other group processes because the team is creating the process so that they own the outcome. And so your role as a facilitator is to focus and tune into the process and that'll help us manage the team dynamics. So this is part 1 of the series. And our goal is every month to provide you with resources and techniques to support your collaborative processes. So what's next? Next month, we're going to talk about creating conditions for playful and mindful facilitation. Sarah Stevens is on the call today. Anne Herberger-Marino, who we've quoted, is not here today because today is her birthday. And so she's taking a couple days off. So I want to respect, again, facilitation is about caretaking, and she is taking care of herself. A reminder, next week we have office hours. So every presentation in this series is followed by office hours. Same time next week, new Zoom link, and we will email that out to everybody. Once again, here is the contact information for myself. Here is Courtney's contact information. And I want to take a moment to see if you all have any questions. We've got a few minutes here before we wrap up. And I will stop. Actually, I want to land on any one of these so you can see us. Office hours, I think we're good. I'm going to stop share so you can see everybody again and ask questions if you've got any.
Thank you so much, Hannah and Courtney. This was wonderful, very fun, very informative. Yeah, who's got questions?
Bethany had one.
Great.
Okay. Do you think someone needs official training to be able to facilitate? I will answer that, but then I want to crowdsource this. I think there are basic things you can do, but I also think it's a really good idea to get outside perspective and outside training. So I have training in conflict resolution, mediation, student facilitation. So I was trained to facilitate roommate conflicts and things like that, like who's going to do the dishes. And then I worked in water conflict facilitation and then went into science facilitation and had formal training every step along the way. And I learned something every single time. And it's also a good reminder, but I want to crowdsource that out to everybody.
Hannah, can I actually say something about that paper you mentioned?
Yes, please, Amanda.
Well, actually, so Hannah mentioned a paper that she's writing, and I'm one of the co-authors on that paper, but the argument we're making there is training, yes, but professional as in role, no. In fact, I think we are arguing that actually there's a really important role for people who are PIs or members of teams to have this skill in ways where they are not an external facilitator. So that's something that we've been playing with, and we'll be putting those ideas out in paper form a little bit later this year.
I'd also like to add that, facilitation becomes a lot more approachable if you know you have a good support system, or you have someone you can turn to and say, hey, this is, my facilitation plan for this particular group tomorrow. What are your thoughts on it? And someone you can bounce ideas off of and get feedback, whether or not that person is co-facilitating with you. And so, being a part of a group like InterReach and, other places where you can get great resources for facilitation is really, really helpful too, especially when you're beginning. And even later on, I'm learning so much just from working with other facilitators. So learning never stops, particularly for facilitation.
Bethany, what do you think? Is she still here?
I don't know what I think. I do not have settled views on this matter yet, which is why I'm excited to have this conversation with you and learning about this series, and cannot wait for that paper.
October, Amanda and Megan are presenting on the article in October. I'm probably not caught up in the chat.
Yeah, I saw Kristine ask what the group thinks are minimum requirements to be a facilitator. And I'm just leaving this open for other people. Go for it, Kristine. Yeah.
No, I was just thinking to take the jumping or diving board that Hannah gave us with in terms of crowdsourcing. Just thinking that it could be an interesting topic for discussion with our Interreach Reading Club, which I'm just pulling up the survey for folks to share topic ideas for that Interreach Reading Club, which happens the 4th Tuesday of every month at the same time. So I will pop that in the chat presently.
I mean, personally, I think one of the minimum requirements is that you're excited to learn and work with people, you know, because at the heart of it, like that's what facilitation is working with the folks who are in the room with you and supporting them in the ways that you can, and always being open to learning. Carrie, that's a good point. Being interested in and believing in the importance of process. Yes, that is also very true. Because there are a lot of folks who don't believe that attending to and thinking about the process is necessarily important. Yes, important to acknowledge that.
Well, I'm gonna pass the baton to Kristine to wrap up, because I believe that when you're done, and it's important to have a quick bio break, fill up your tea, get water between things. So we'll be around next week for office hours. If you all want to chat more, we will send that link out via Zoom. And Kristine, do you want to take it home?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you again to both Hannah and Courtney, and very, very excited about the office hours next week. Seems like a great opportunity for us to practice. As I think it was Alyssa said in the chat, how important that is for facilitation. And then very excited about the rest of the series. So thank you guys, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all for your engagement. It was really great chatting with you all.